As John said, I am Sami Kauffman. I am the sports dietitian for Parkview Sports Medicine. Today, we're going to talk about nutrition periodization and macronutrient requirements for our athletic population. I'm pretty loose when it comes to presenting, so if you have questions, just spit them out at me. We don't need to put them in the chat. We don't need to do anything like that. Just turn on your speaker, interrupt me, and ask what you need to ask, because I understand what it's like to sometimes forget. If you're more comfortable putting it in the chat, that's completely fine as well, whatever works best for you. But like I said, don't feel like you can't just interrupt me. So today I want to start with a little bit of a cover of kind of what is nutrition periodization. So nutrition periodization is how we adapt nutrition to improve our athletic performance. So how can we tie the two together so that training and nutrition work hand in hand to maximize the benefits that we're getting? This practice dates back to the ancient Olympic Games. We did have periodization even then, and it is not only planning for the short term, the medium term, and the long term, but it is for every stage of training. Sorry guys, it's taking a little, pull that up in full screen. We'll see if it comes up. We want to make sure that not only while our athletes are training for endurance or strength, but also while they're resting and recovering, while they're off season, in season, we want to make sure that their nutrition matches that so that we are getting the best benefits that we can. We consider this fueling for the work required. So, you know, we don't all eat the same every day. We vary the amount that we eat. We vary the types of foods that we're eating throughout the year, just like we vary our training. So we want to make sure that those are matching so we're getting the most benefit possible. Typically, we tend to eat the same types of foods, but we vary in whether we're going out with people, whether we are hungrier that day or less hungry. So we want to make sure that our nutrition programs are as individualized as the individual is, their goals, their desires for what they're going to get from their training. All right, so why do we want to periodize? Training goals vary, so our nutrition should too. We have high volume weeks, we have recovery weeks, we have low volume, we have long, slow endurance days. We want to make sure that our training load matches our nutrients. The more we train, the more we need to intake to make sure that we're getting those adaptations met completely. So our goals are going to be to meet energy fluctuations and the goal of each training session and phase. If we are training harder, adapting faster, recovering fully, those things are going to come from our nutrition. Coaches are fabulous, and I would never, ever negate their need. But when it comes to maximizing what you're telling the athlete to do, if the food isn't there and the food isn't right, it's not going to happen. The body just can't maximize without having the nutrients that we need. Maximization of their food intake to match their goals and their training is also going to allow us to maintain a stronger immune system, which with our athletes right now is incredibly important. It's going to give us better overall health, and when we're healthier, it's easier to meet our body composition goals if we have any of those as well. So our athletes who are looking to gain strength, lose fat, put on weight, those athletes are really going to benefit even more from this than others. So when we're looking at developing a periodization plan, how do we go about that? So one of the first things we have to do is we have to determine the goals of the athlete. What their current diet history is, how they're eating already, what phase of their training they're in. So are they on season? Are they off season? Are we looking to gain strength? Are we looking to increase endurance, decrease body fat? All of those things are going to affect how we tweak their nutrition. Some of the cycles that we tend to match with, these aren't always for every individual, but preparation, competition, transition phases. So these are some of the goals and how they match up with typical nutrition periodization. So if we're looking to increase endurance, functional strength, and flexibility, if we're more in a low intensity stage of training, or we're looking for weight loss or gain, This would be what we look at as our preparation phase. This is preseason for most individuals. We want to make sure that we are getting basic eating habits and hydration habits met, that we are maintaining blood sugar response. So if our blood sugar isn't stable, we are going to store more fat. If our blood sugar swings from high to low, the body sends out a signal to store additional fat. So if we can keep that blood sugar stable, we're going to prevent some of that. We want to improve metabolic efficiency. So can we use the substrate, meaning fat, protein, or carbohydrate, in the manner that we need to be using it now? There are certain stages of training in which certain nutrients are better, such as with endurance athletes. Fat is usually better utilized as a substrate for exercise, and so those individuals, we need to make sure that they're using fat efficiently. Whereas our strength individuals need more carbohydrate and protein because those are the substrates that's going to fuel their workouts. We always want to be focusing on anti-inflammatory foods. So these are going to be our fruits, our vegetables, our healthy fats, our omega-3s, your fish oils, your flaxseed, those kind of things. Any blood work that needs to be done, we want to be doing that here to make sure that we are stabilizing all of our blood levels. And we can begin experimenting with any of the sports nutrition products we're going to use. So in this case, supplements. This is where training the gut comes in. We don't want to go straight into competition season utilizing a supplement that we don't know how it's going to affect our body. We see this a lot with endurance athletes who are not training their gut for running. We have a lot of bathroom issues that occur. So this is where we really want to be working on making sure that anything that's in our diet is not going to affect us during the competition stage, that it's going to settle well. We're not going to have any GI distress that could impede our ability to compete the way that we want to. As we move into the competition phase, our goal is usually going to be improving strength and power. We want to, meet that simulation of what it's going to be like when we are actually in our competition. So when we're playing a game, when we're at a meet, those kind of things. Typically training here is a higher volume and intensity load. So we're going to increase overall intake. We're going to increase carbohydrates around our workout so that we can specifically fuel beforehand and after. So protein is really important for athletes, but protein is kind of like the engine in a car. If we don't have a fuel, that car is not going to go anywhere. So we need to make sure that we have both. So carbohydrates centered around our workouts will allow us to not only fuel the workout itself, but we will also be able to fuel the ability to replace that muscle glycogen. And that's going to give us that fuel for muscle building. That way protein can be reserved for actually becoming new muscle. Carbohydrates will provide the fuel to do so. We want to make sure that we are emphasizing recovery. So we're getting timely intake of protein. We want to make sure that protein comes into that equation after the workout. We want to make sure that it is introduced through whole foods preferably, and then supplements. And we want it to be within the golden range used to be an hour. And now we generally say if you're going to eat a full meal within 2 hours, we don't need to have additional protein. But if it's going to be longer than 2 hours for that full meal, then we want to go ahead and have some protein with our carbohydrate right after our workout. We'll be looking to emphasize functional hydration. So are we getting enough fluid on a daily basis, but do we also know how to get enough in during competition, during workouts, and to do so without causing any GI distress or needs to use the bathroom, which would be untimely for us. And we want to boost our antioxidant-rich foods. So we want to make sure we're including plenty of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and good healthy meat choices. As far as transition phase, this is going to be the off season for most of our athletes. This is where they get a little bit of a break. Training kind of ramps down a little bit. We may be looking to alter body composition the most during this stage in preparation for moving into competition season. So we're going to decrease overall intake because as our physical activity decreases, our needs decrease as well. We are going to decrease carbohydrates because we're not going to be as active, so we don't need as much fuel. And we are going to remove any sports nutrition products. We don't need supplements during the off season. We will start to ramp those back up in preseason in preparation for competition season. All right. So how do we fine tune these goals to each individual? So we want to break down the current phase of their workouts and determine what the coach's goal is for each of those workouts. Are we pushing to a threshold? Are we sitting back a little bit on our laurels that day? Is it going to be a long, slow effort? Is it going to be a high intensity, short effort? Those things are going to affect it. Like I said, for our endurance athletes who tend to be more of a long, slow effort, fat tends to be the preferred fuel. So we will not add additional carbohydrates in for them, but we will make sure that their pre-workout fueling has a little bit of fat in it. Whereas with a strength athlete or someone who is doing more of a high intensity, we want to make sure that we are limiting the amount of fat so that it's not slowing down absorption of the carbohydrates and protein that we need, and that we're adding enough adequate carbohydrate in. So I've given you some kind of breakdowns to see the thought process that we kind of go through when we are working on a periodization for an athlete. So we need to know not only what are their event or sport specific needs, but also what are the psychological aspects of that as well, because food is very tied to our psyches. It's a very important part of our thought process, and it's one of the things that we can control. So for athletes who are being told what to do and when, sleep and food tend to be two things that they have a lot more control over. So we have to build a little bit of personal preference as well as some of those psychological ties into their food. So we need to look at what are their gaps. So what are they already doing food-wise? What do we need to alter to get where we need to be? We also want to look at their training in terms of macros, mesos, and microcycles. So what are we doing within that day or two? What are we doing within that week? And what are we looking at longer term? Make sure that any gaps that are there, we're addressing those as well. And then we want to know what are some of the interventions that match with those goals for each of those cycles so that we can determine where we're going to go with those personalized interventions. So this gives you kind of a feel for what a periodization could look like, and some of the changes that we make based on those different cycles. So carbohydrates, starting with those. When we're looking at a macro cycle and we're talking about looking at multiple months of an athlete's training, we want to alter their daily carbohydrates to match that training. So we want to increase it when we're in general prep, when their volume is going to be higher. And then as we move into competition, we want to decrease their intake as volume becomes a little lower. We tend to have a little more rest days built around that actual event. And training tends to vary as we come out of the event and approach the next one. As we look at carbohydrates for each week, we want to focus on how do we fuel for the intensity of their sessions to adapt their gastrointestinal tract to prepare for that event. So are we looking at adding in particular types of carbohydrates? Do we need particular types of supplements as well? So when we're talking about the different types of carbohydrates, there are two main types of carbohydrates that we utilize to fuel athletes. We use glucose and we use fructose. So glucose is quickly absorbed, fructose is a little slower absorbing, but the body can only absorb certain amounts. So we can absorb up to 40 grams of glucose, but over that, it tends to cause GI distress. So we want to make sure that we're using fructose to match that. So we want to start building in during those weeks, how can we adapt their body to handle more fructose, because it can cause some GI distress for certain individuals. So we're making adaptations over those weeks to account for that. As we get within days of the event, we start to manipulate the availability to enhance recovery. So how do we build up muscle glycogen? How do we make sure there's enough carbohydrate already stored in those muscles that we can get through the event and we can start to recover? We also want to make sure that we are adding in enough on the day before, the day of, and the day after to assure that we recover completely. With protein, we're going to adjust that depending on the demands of their phase for the month blocks. If we are looking at hard versus recovery, we're going to increase protein. So 0.8 grams per kilogram is pretty normal for an average individual. When we're looking at harder training and we're not in a recovery, we're going to ramp that up to 1.5, sometimes even 2 grams per kilogram to make sure that they're getting enough. As we get closer in weeks to our event, we're going to increase to about 2 grams per kilogram per day to make sure that we have enough to prevent any skeletal muscle losses. When we have a competition, a match, an event, a race, we want to make sure that there's plenty of protein available to provide muscle gain, but we also don't want to lose any skeletal muscle because we want to make sure that we're keeping bone strong, that we are protecting bone health, and that we are maintaining any strength. We don't want to be pulling from that muscle because the body's going to pull carbohydrate that's floating through the bloodstream first. Then it's going to pull from muscle second because muscle is easier to break down than fat and doesn't cause us as much energy to convert into glucose to use as fuel. For the couple of days surrounding any event, we're going to optimize our protein, not only type, but amount and timing, because again, fat's going to play into this. We can use supplements to make sure that we're getting that protein in. We may want to use less of a whole form. So instead of using a full food form, we might want to use essential amino acids or branched chain amino acids to meet specific needs to make sure that we are going to adapt and recover appropriately. 2 other nutrients that are important. So iron is very important for our athletes. Athletes are found to sweat out up to 6 times more iron than the average individual. So we want to make sure that we're getting adequate dietary iron throughout all of the sessions. But if we're going to be doing altitude training or high temperature training, we want to make sure that we're increasing the iron intake via a supplement. This can cause some GI distress, so we want to make sure we're doing it early so that we don't have any upset stomachs or any changes in bowels that could affect performance. We are going to make sure that when we are taking some time away from training, we're also adding in vitamin C, and we're separating calcium from their iron intake just because calcium can impede iron absorption. The one nutrient that has been found to be considered gold standard as far as supplementation goes is creatine. Creatine helps to not only swell the muscle with fluid, but it does assist in the creation of new protein. So we want to make sure that we are using creatine appropriately, that we're using it in 2-month hypertrophy training blocks. So if your athlete is going through any hypertrophy training, we want to be utilizing creatine then. The dosing is 5 grams per day. We used to think that creatine required a introductory period, but that is not the fact any longer. We know that we can begin it and stop it without any need to ramp up or ramp down. So your athlete can add that in. We do get minimal amounts of creatine from our protein sources, but a supplement really is our best option here. We then move into the weeks before an event, and we're going to start doing any loading that we may need to do. If we have an athlete who's going through short interval training and we are looking to put on muscle mass, we may add in additional creatine to make sure that they are getting that. Or if they weren't going through hypertrophy training prior to the few weeks before an event, we may then add in that up to 5-gram dose in this period. And then we want to make sure that we are optimizing uptake surrounding it by including carbohydrates in the post-training window. We're going to do that anyways because we want to recover, but we're going to combine our creatine with our carbohydrate. It allows for better absorption. It's going to be utilized much, much faster if we're doing so. So what is the practical application of this? How do we take all of that data and make it work for each individual athlete? Because not every athlete is going to like to implement in the same manner. Some, just don't have the GI adaptation to eat prior to working out, or they don't like to work out with things in their stomach, including fluid. So how do we adjust those to meet each individual's needs? So we're going to go over some of those. Our most altered nutrient as far as periodization goes is going to be carbohydrates. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is manipulating those. They are necessary for endurance performance, and as we talked about, they're necessary for increasing strength as well. There can be benefits to training low carbohydrates. So there are instances where we're going to implement that, and we're going to talk about that as well. We have not seen performance improvements with high fat, low carbohydrate intake over long periods of time, though. So, for athletes who are interested in the keto diet, for example, I know keto is really, really big right now. Um, Keto has shown some benefit in endurance athletes, not in strength athletes at this point, but only in short spurts. So we wouldn't want them to be following it long term. It wouldn't be a lifestyle for them. It would be more of a manipulation prior to or during certain periods of their training. So protein intake, we want to keep that relatively consistent. As you saw when we discussed protein in the chart, that for the most part, other than during our recovery phase, protein's going to be kept high. We are going to increase it slightly during the competition phase just to make sure that we're meeting the needs for recovery and the increased demands. And we always want to make sure that it's a priority after training to encourage healthy function and that we are building hormones appropriately. So now we're going to look over some periodization plates. This is kind of what we would expect our plates to look like as we were moving through for your basic athlete. We take this and then we alter based on the type of athlete they are, their personal preferences, and any personal goals. So during our preparatory phase, we want the plate to be primarily protein and fruits and vegetables. We don't need a lot of carbohydrate intake here. Most of our carbohydrates are going to be centered around any training that they are getting, whether that be low intensity or even some mobility training. Looking at our competition phase, this is where we're going to start to add in some whole grains. We're going to add in some of the supplement products that we've talked about, whether that be a protein supplement or a creatine supplement. There are some others that we'll talk about at the end that you can periodize as well. And then as we move into a taper, we're going to remove any of those supplemental products. We're going to increase our fruits and vegetables, decrease those whole grains a little bit because we don't need quite as much fuel. And then we hit that transition phase, we're going to decrease those whole grains even further, increase those fruits and vegetables, and start to move towards what our plate will look like for the preparatory as well. So types of periodization that we have. We have what we call train high, where we are training with lots of carbohydrates, both in the bloodstream and full muscle glycogen. So all of those glucose stores in the muscle are full. And then we have train low. So this is going to be where we're going to alter carbohydrates so that we're kind of training in a fasted stage. It's not always fasted. It may just be lower availability. Sometimes it's as simple as we are dehydrating the muscle of glucose, or we are just altering it in the bloodstream. And then we're going to talk about some methods to improve gut function as well, because we do want to periodize that as well. So this is a table that shows you some of the different options for the different methods. So when we look at train low, we have a couple of different options. If we're training twice a day, we can limit our carbohydrate intake so that we are depleting the glycogen. So we're going to perform our first session. We're going to restrict carbohydrate intake in that post-exercise period and the period between our first and second training of the day. And then we're going to train later that day with lowered glycogen in the muscle so that we have not only a lower state of glycogen in the muscle, but we also have a lower state of glucose running through the bloodstream. So this can express some different relevant genes. For some individuals, it can be beneficial to help them with strength increases. It can allow the body to overcome adaptations of using certain fuels. So if we're trying to alter their fuel use, let's say we had a strength athlete, we had a football player, for example, who has always eaten a very high fat diet. Maybe they were keto previously. This can allow us to start to move them from a ketogenic diet into more of a carbohydrate state, excuse me. So it allows us to kind of alter some of that gene expression so that we can prepare the body to run in more of a high carbohydrate state. We can train fasted. So this allows us to perform an overnight fast before exercise. I know typically we encourage athletes to get adequate carbohydrate the night before we are going to be doing any training, but sometimes there is benefits here. This is going to, sorry guys, we Gotta guess. Um, we're going to not only deplete some of the carbohydrates in the muscle, but we're aiming to get it out of the liver more so. So we're not going to have as much circulating in the bloodstream. So we're going to have to pull more from that muscle. It's going to cause a little more damage. It's going to allow us to do a little more reparation in the long term, as long as our post-workout nutrition is good. This is going to, I mean, it is an option for our individuals who are not keen on eating a lot in the evenings, who don't like performing with a lot in their stomachs because they're not going to want to eat the next day, and who don't have any blood sugar issues. So their blood sugar tends to be pretty stable. We're not going to be looking at any dips in that that's going to cause dips in performance the next day. There are insufficient studies right now to show that this causes huge performance improvements, but there isn't any detriment shown yet. So if we do have athletes that prefer to perform this way, it is something that we can use. If we want to look at exogenous carbohydrate availability, so this is where we are draining the body. We're trying to create a higher stress response. Basically, we want to make sure that we're not getting a lot of carbohydrate during prolonged exercise. So not only are we altering potentially the carbohydrate intake the night before, the carbohydrate intake prior to, but we're not getting any in during. A lot of times we'll tell athletes, if we're exercising for extended periods of time, we've got, training camps, for example, where we're going to be training all day. We want to be taking in some carbohydrate during that training, usually in the form of liquids, simply because we want to make sure that we are not causing any GI distress, and putting food in is going to cause some upset there. But we want to present that in liquid form so that we're staying hydrated and we're also staying fueled. This approach, we're looking to limit that carbohydrate that we're getting during prolonged exercise so the body can learn to adapt to running on other fuels. So this is really great for endurance runners. It teaches our body to perform in marathons without a lot of fuel. Yes, there are stations where they can hydrate and they can grab some Gatorade or things like that, but it's not enough carbohydrates. And often we don't carry enough with us either to make sure that we are fully fueled. So this is another option for those individuals. We have the option of low carbohydrate availability during recovery. This again is going to alter that stress response. So it's going to prolong it rather than just exaggerating it. We're not going to take in a lot of carbohydrate in the post-recovery window. We're going to let that kind of sit back, not take in as much. As far as the type of individuals that this is beneficial for, anyone that we're looking to kind of cause a little more damage to a muscle so that we can build it up a little faster, this can be beneficial as well. Sleep low is another one. So this is where we have a training session late in the day and we go to bed with little to no carbohydrate taken in. So we're not going to refuel after our workout in the evening. We're not going to get up and fuel either. It's very similar to low carbohydrate availability, but that post-exercise period is going to be longer than it was during some of the other stages we see here. So we are going to decrease not only the liver glycogen, so that glucose that is cycling in the body, and the muscle glycogen while we're sleeping. It's going to deplete the glycogen, which is going to cause more lipolysis. So we are going to break down more fatty acids. This can be something that if we have an athlete looking to take off quite a bit of weight in a short period of time, this is a manipulation that we can utilize for them to assist with that in a manner that is less painful than significantly cutting calories to where they would not be able to perform. So the next one is low carbohydrate, high fat ketogenic diets. This is going to be the last one of our train low, and I know we kind of discussed ketogenic diets briefly. Like I said, for endurance athletes, this can be beneficial, but we don't find that for strength athletes, ketogenic diets are beneficial in any way, shape, or form. We don't want to be restricting their carbohydrates for long periods of time because they're not going to have that fuel to build muscle. And we're going to start breaking down muscle to utilize. So our endurance athletes, our runners, they tend to be naturally leaner, have less skeletal muscle than our strength athletes, and it benefits in that manner. So to utilize some of their muscle as fuel isn't going to be as harmful as it would be if we had a strength athlete who we don't want to be using any of that hard-earned muscle. All right, so shifting into the train high sessions, we have two, and then we'll move into training the gut. So when we are training high, our two major alterations are to alter the diet and alter how much the body is storing. So training with high muscle and liver glycogen is our first. And this is where we're going to make sure that we are taking in high amounts of carbohydrate before training to assure that all of our glycogen stores are as full as they can get. We actually can work to increase carbohydrate intake to where we can expand the amount of glycogen that the muscle and the liver can hold. So that can be beneficial as well for athletes when we're looking to make sure that they have adequate fuel. So if we have athletes who don't enjoy eating around the time of training, an example of this would be carb loading in the evening. So if we carb loaded at night, we don't have to take in as much the day of, and it allows us to fill all of our glycogen stores without having to take in immediate carb prior to an event and have to worry about that GI distress. Training with a high carbohydrate diet is one of the most common alterations that we do with Train High. This is just keeping carbohydrates high on a daily basis. It's throughout the entire day. It's spread out. It's not specifically in one area rather than another. We don't save all of our carbs for the evening or right before a training, but we do try to make sure that our intake is a little higher surrounding our training. That's always something that we want to do because then we're going to fuel coming into it and we're going to recover coming out. So training the gut's important because if we're going to be taking in any fuel surrounding our workouts, we need to make sure that we have adequate ability to digest whatever it is that we're eating. So some athletes can only handle water prior to exercise. Some can only handle carbohydrates in the form of liquids. Others can sit down, eat a full high fat, high carb, high protein meal, go out and run around and have no issues. Really depends on how well they have trained that. So we can train any athlete to be able to digest food while exercising. It's just not always ideal. So when we're doing it, we want to train a couple of things. We want to train the ability to exercise with food in our stomach. So can we increase the volume that they can handle before we have any distress? So instead of only being able to tolerate 8 ounces of water the day of exercise prior to an event, like some of the athletes I've seen, we can sit down, we can have a full meal within a couple of hours and be able to perform with that residual still in our stomachs. We also want to train the ability to empty the stomach to move things through the system. So using meals of varying types of substrate, so carbs, proteins, etc., we can increase gastric mobility, so allow food to dump from the stomach into the intestines and through the system faster, depending on the content of that food. It can allow us to also kind of work around reducing stomach discomfort, because if we can move food through the system faster, we're not going to have to play with it sitting in that stomach. We don't have any of that sloshing feeling that sometimes our athletes will get. I know, sometimes we call it water belly. So we've got that fluid shifting around that kind of makes us queasy, or if we have that feeling of fullness that kind of gives that sense of nausea. So we're going to train absorption as well. So if we are in, for example, a ketogenic diet, our body has learned to absorb and utilize fat and protein faster as opposed to carbohydrate. And so that body cannot absorb carbohydrate the way that a typical human body is set up to do. The way that our diet history evolves affects our ability to utilize and absorb different nutrients. So we want to make some adjustments to make sure that we can absorb things and prevent any intestinal distress. So this is where introducing supplements comes in. We want to make sure that our supplements are utilized well and that they're being absorbed and not causing any upset. So if we have creatine itself typically doesn't cause any digestive issues. However, sometimes the supplement we're using has flavorings or other vitamins or minerals added into it. B vitamins, for example, have a tendency to dehydrate. And so we want to make sure that if that is present, that we are, altering things. Certain flavorings and certain colorings can cause GI distress. So we want to avoid those or train the body to be able to adjust to those. When we are looking at training race nutrition, this is specifically for runners as far as our other athletes. So your stop and go athletes, your football players, your soccer players, volleyball players, they don't have to train quite as much because typically that need for constant fuel isn't present. Usually we're going to fuel beforehand. We're going to fuel in the form of quick digesting sugars. So whether that be Gatorade, Powerade, Body Armor, any other beverage that provides carbohydrate, or simple sugars in the form of gummy bears or pixie sticks or honey. Those things generally absorb very, very quickly. They're pure glucose and we don't have any digestive issues with those. But we want to make sure that whatever we're going to utilize for a day of nutrition, that we have practiced it, that we've made sure that it agrees with our bodies, and that we are prepared to utilize it appropriately. So when we're looking at periodizing supplements, there are a couple of different categories that we have. So we have supplements that allow us to build in more training to perform better. We have caffeine, which is one of the best pre-workouts that exist on the market. So if you have an athlete looking for a pre-workout, caffeine is going to be it. It can provide a slight edge to athletes who are in the higher levels. High school and middle school aged athletes, I typically don't recommend caffeine as a pre-workout just because it's very individualized. You need to know your dosage that works best for you, because we have high absorbers and low absorbers, and we want to make sure that it's not moving through the system too quickly or it's not moving through too slowly, because we don't want any shakiness or jitteriness that would affect their ability to perform. We also have bicarbonate and nitrates in this category. At this point, neither are proven as gold standard. They do have some ability to increase the blood flow, which therefore gets our nutrients where they need to be faster, but they don't carry enough weight yet that as a dietitian, I generally recommend these to our athletes. Creatine again appears here, so it's going to allow us to perform a little longer. It's going to allow us to build additional muscle. Supplements that initiate or increase protein synthesis. So these specifically are going to trigger the building of protein. So your essential amino acids and your branched chain amino acids, your leucine, which does fit into the branched chain amino acids, but is particularly the important of the three, leucine, valine, and isoleucine. And then your hydroxymethylate. So hydroxymethylate, again, doesn't carry enough weight that we make large recommendations of this. It's utilized most with athletes who have some form of alteration in blood chemistries at this point. So if their labs aren't coming back normal, sometimes we will utilize these to help stabilize things so that they can build protein better. But branched chain amino acids used to be the gold standard. We're finding right now that the evidence is showing that actually essential amino acids might be even better than branched chain. The evidence shows that right now, 2 servings of essential amino acids is equivalent to 1 serving of whey in the post-exercise as far as muscle building goes, and that 2 servings of essential amino acids combined with a serving of whey can give up to 3 times the muscle growth that we found with just whey itself. So evidence is kind of moving in that direction to include full, complete proteins, whether it be a supplement or a food at this point. Then we have our supplements with the potential to increase mitochondrial biogenesis. So these are going to be things that allow us to build new powerhouses in the cell. Better, stronger powerhouse we have, the more powerhouses we have, the more active that cell is. So we have things like our green tea extract, our resveratrol, and quercetin, which are our most common. These are found in basic foods. So you've got your green tea extract in your green tea. Resveratrol is found in our wines and grape skins and dark chocolate. And quercetin is found in foods that are tannic, so coffees and teas. These we utilize to some degree. Resveratrol and quercetin tend to have more health benefits than they do performance benefits. And so we will utilize those sometimes with athletes who have heart conditions, for example. These can be really beneficial for those individuals. So the next two slides are just going to give you an idea of what a periodization plan might look like. So how we would kind of set that up. On this plan, you can see red squares, which are going to be areas of low carbohydrate intake, yellow, which is moderate, and green, which are going to be high carbohydrate. So for example, on the first day, that Monday, they're going into their strength workout with low carb. They're going to continue the low carbohydrate through their post-training and lunch session, moving into their bike session. And then after they finish their bike session, they're going to refuel. So this would be an example of that 2-a-day that we had talked about, where we keep the carbohydrate fueling low throughout, and then we recover afterwards. There are some periods where we're only going to limit carbohydrate intake to meals. So for example, most of our exercise periods, we're not restricting carbohydrate for these individuals. We do have one bike session that we're only allowing hydration, and we're limiting the amount of carbohydrate they can have. We do also have a fueled workout in there that we're going to have some carbohydrate present during the workout. That's where we're testing that gut. The next one's going to kind of give you one based on the intensity of the sessions as opposed to what type of session are we doing. So you can see the pre-training meals, during training, post-training, and evening meals on these. This is done by day, and you've got, high intensity sessions that are long periods of time. You've got some low intensity steady state built in there. On the days where we have high intensity, our carbohydrate intake is higher, versus the days where we have low intensity. We're going to enter into that in a low state. We're going to continue through that in a low state as well, because we don't need as much carbohydrate for those. All right, so there are some disadvantages to training low that I want to talk about. As far as training high, there aren't really any disadvantages. The more carbohydrate we can use, the more fuel we have. So it's always important to look at that. But one of the drawbacks is that it does impact muscle protein synthesis. So like we talked about, carbohydrate provides that gas for the engine. And if we don't have that, then it may impair our ability to produce more muscle. We may not get as much growth, even if leucine is kept high. So let's say we're supplementing with amino acids, we've got great protein intake, we're at that 2 grams per kilogram, but if we are taking in high fat and limiting the carbohydrate, we may be limiting the amount of muscle that we can maximally put on. We could impact work capacity, so the ability to perform at the same intensity is going to be limited for us. This could compromise any high intensity sessions that they have. So we really want to make sure that if we're going to implement train low, that we're doing it in an appropriate manner. It's going to allow us to stay away from those high intensity sessions and enter those fully prepared. One other impact is that we can have some impact on immune function. So high intensity sessions by nature are immunosuppressive. They're going to kind of lower that immune system. And if we don't have enough carbohydrate, that effect can be exacerbated. It can be made worse. So if we have an athlete who, for example, is in keto and is always ill, it may be time to look at returning them to more of a train high session, working them out of that because they've worked themselves to the point where they're diminishing their immune system so much that we're not getting any benefit. Studies have shown that that not all train low sessions are going to have long-term performance benefits, but there are no detriment to them. So we're not necessarily doing much damage, but we may not be meeting the goals of the athlete if we're not careful about when we implement train low days. So if we are going to utilize train low days, there are some practical considerations we want to look at. We want to make sure that protein is consumed prior to exercise. It's not going to have a negative effect, but we do need to train the body. So some proteins come along with fat. So if we're taking a whole food form, we want to make sure that we have trained the gut for that. And we want to get 20 to 30 grams of high quality protein before these sessions. When I say high quality, we want to make sure it's either whole food or we're looking at a whey isolate, at least, let's stay away from blends in this period is basically what we're looking at here. Because if we're looking at some of the lower quality wheys or we're getting casein in here, we're not going to get the protein substrate that we need in a timely manner. Caffeine is another consideration here. It can be beneficial to these individuals to help with that dip in performance that we would see when we're training low. So caffeine can help to offset that a little bit so that we can push a little harder, a little longer. And mouth rinsing with carbohydrates can also be beneficial. So this is some newer science. This first came out in soccer players and then progressed into runners, but we are utilizing it in a lot of different athletes, especially those who have GI issues. So those who don't like to train with anything in their stomachs or find it difficult to take in liquids during training, this can allow them to get carbohydrate into the system without having to actually put anything in their stomach. So basically, they take a mouthful of any beverage that contains carbohydrate, they're going to swish it around and then spit it out after 20 seconds. This is going to allow the mucosal linings to absorb that carbohydrate, and we'll be able to utilize some of it. We're not going to get all of it like if we took it in orally, but we will get some. So it's going to help to offset some of that glycogen depletion. So periodization based on sport. So I just wanted to cover some brief sports that have some specifics. Running, again, we want to consider utilizing some sleep low, train low for them because that's going to have less effect because fat is the substrate that they utilize the most. Combat sports. In combat sports, we tend to find that they've got a weight to make anyways, and so there is going to be some carbohydrate restriction. So we can go ahead and plan our carbohydrate restriction, our train low sessions to match up with when they're trying to make weight anyways, so that we are taking that weight off in an intelligent manner and doing it so that it's not going to impact performance any more than it has to. We can manipulate their energy intake by manipulating their carbohydrates. As far as team sports go, low and moderate carbohydrate intakes for recovery and technical days and high carbohydrate for our intense days are what we're really going to want to look at. So those train low days we're going to utilize primarily when they're recovering or we're just having technical sessions. All right, so now that we've moved through periodization, we're going to cover some of the basic nutrition needs for athletes. Again, this varies some based on sport, position, and goal. But we always base it off their BMR, so their basal metabolic rate. Typically, we have a couple different ways to do this. We're going to use either the Mifflin-St. Jean equation, or we are going to do a calorie per kilogram, depending on the sport, depending on the athlete and what their goal is. If they are looking more for maintenance or gain, we're going to use more of the Mifflin-St. Jean. If we're looking at weight loss, we can use more of a calorie per kilogram. If we are using Mifflin-St. Jean, we are going to add in an activity factor to accommodate for that additional activity. That may be sometimes in the form of just adding in how many calories they're actually burning during a session if we have good data on that, or we'll use an actual factor. So the Mifflin-St. Jean equation is here for you. It does use age, height, and weight. It is just the calories that we need to maintain heart rate, respiration, and body temperature, nothing else. So that's why we use an activity factor with this. As you can see, it does differ for women versus men. Women have a slight deficit in the calories. Men get to add a little bit in. So when we're calculating that total daily energy expenditure, again, we're going to add in some additional. So most of our athletes, depending on their sport, are going to use an activity factor of 1.55 or 1.75. We can vary that a little bit depending on goals. Deficits, we never want to go below 20% with an athlete unless we're in the off season and we need to take off a large amount of weight for health reasons as opposed to performance reasons. Taking off too much too fast can really impact performance even later on during their season. So protein needs. We look at 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight for all of our athletes based on their goal. We have higher needs with desired weight loss. So if we have an individual who wants to take off weight loss, we're going to increase protein, because with increased protein comes increased fat, and protein is satiating. So it's going to help to keep us fuller longer. It's going to build that muscle, and it's also going to prevent us from having any losses. As far as fat needs go, for endurance athletes, we specify 20 to 35% of their total daily intake. For strength athletes, it's going to be the remainder of their calories. We are going to calculate carbs, we're going to calculate protein for these athletes, and then we're going to take whatever's left and calculate in the fat at 9 calories per gram. There is some play whether we are looking at fat loss, muscle gain, increased endurance, what have you. So we can alter that a little bit to adjust for that. But carbohydrates are a big one. So for all of our athletes, we're going to use various amounts depending on what their training looks like, depending on what their skills are. So for our strength athletes, we're going to go greater than 5 grams per kilogram. We're going to go anywhere from 6 to 10 if you're doing very, very vigorous training, such as 2-a-days, camps, off-season conditioning, things like that. Endurance athletes range anywhere from 3 to 12 grams per kilogram, depending on the type of training, how long it is, and as we ramp up during their training, moving towards a marathon or event, they're going to increase their carbohydrate intake as well as their gut training. All right. So additional considerations. There are some considerations we need to discuss when we talk about female athletes. Because female athletes have hormonal changes that vary from month to month and week to week, we need to alter their daily intake to match that. When our athletes are in a high hormone phase, this is the phase right after their menstruation, but before they ovulate, that phase is going to be where our hormones are the highest. They are going to need additional food. They're going to have an increased metabolic rate, but they're also going to have a greater ability to build strength during this period as well. So we want to make sure they're getting a little extra food to kind of fuel that. So if you have female athletes, we want to make sure they're tracking their cycle, that they're aware of what underfueling symptoms look like, so that we're making sure that if they're experiencing any of those, we can start to increase it. And we can use fasted training in females to optimize fat loss, but it can blunt fat burning and the metabolic rate. So we want to use that for very short periods of time in women. Fasted training and ketogenic diets are actually shown to be more harmful for female athletes than for male athletes. So we want to make sure that in those individuals, we're carefully monitoring them, that they're working very closely with a dietitian, that we're using it for very, very short periods of time. All right, so this is my list of resources that I utilized. Team USA has some really great information on periodization if it's something you're looking for, but particularly the framework for periodized nutrition for athletes and the fuel for work required are 2 really great articles that I highly recommend reading if this is something that you want to implement with your athletes. Graham Close wrote the second article, and he is a researcher from Ireland, and he is incredible with athletes. The article is very, very good. If you have any questions now, I'm happy to answer those for you. You can also reach out to me afterwards if you have any questions, then I'd be happy to answer that too. So anything that I can answer for you today? We're very quiet. Well, I know I threw a lot at you, but thank you for having me today, and please don't hesitate to reach out. John, is there anything that you need to say to kind of wrap things up?
Yeah, we got a question here. Do you have athletes who are sensitive to dairy?
To dairy? Yes, I do work with athletes that are sensitive to dairy. In those individuals, we can utilize a calcium and vitamin D supplement to make sure that we are meeting their needs to keep bones nice and strong. We can also use some vitamin K depending on what their DEXAs come back looking like. If they're extremely low, bordering on osteopenia or osteoporosis, we'll add in vitamin K, magnesium. But we can also utilize any of the dairy alternatives. Now, if you have an athlete that is sensitive to dairy, though, whey may still be an option for them as far as supplements go, unless they have an actual allergy. If they have an allergy, I would avoid whey altogether. But if it's just a sensitivity, usually whey is broken down enough and has the lactate included, so it will not cause digestive issues. But as far as daily dietary intake goes, utilizing those alternative milks and then adding in supplementation to make sure that we're meeting those needs as well.
All right, got another question. We got two other questions here. First one, do you make any comments on plant protein versus whey protein?
Plant protein versus whey protein. I have these discussions with the athlete if they express that that's something they're interested in. If they are vegan, vegetarian, or they're just looking to decrease the footprint of utilization, whey is by far the gold standard. It is a complete protein. Whey and egg are two complete proteins. So if they don't want to use a whey protein, or they, don't want to, they can't tolerate it, egg is usually my next one I go to, would be a dried egg protein. But plant proteins, it really depends on the individual's taste. As far as pea versus hemp versus, good Lord, we have coconut and banana now. There's tons of different plant proteins. It's really about flavor preference. None of them digest necessarily better than another, and none of them provide more bioavailable protein than another. So if we're looking at an athlete who is vegetarian, vegan, can't tolerate whey protein or egg protein, or just prefers not to utilize those products, we try to get enough protein through the diet first, and then utilize those additional products based on their individual preference. They're going to get protein from them, and it is great protein. It's just not going to absorb at the same rate that whey would. So to get the same absorption amount, they would have to use a greater volume. Does that make sense? And I think the last is one of my thoughts on Cunningham versus the PMR. So the Cunningham equation is a great option as well. We do sometimes use that. It depends on the dietitian and their preference. Cunningham isn't necessarily my preference, just because I don't always have access to the information needed, and it's a little more involved to run the equation than it is for our Mifflin St. George. But if you know the athlete's lean body mass and you have a good reliable form to measure that. So if we are doing pinch tests, for example, we've got to use the exact same individual performing the test every time. If we're using a bod pod or a DEXA, we're going to get a little more reliable data. But because body composition can be altered so often by fluid intake, I like to have more than just one measure if I'm going to use the Cunningham equation versus the Mifflin St. George. Generally, I will start my athletes with the Mifflin St. George, and then we just treat each athlete like an N equals 1. We alter their diet based on what their body is doing. So we follow the diet for a week to 3 weeks, depending on what their diet history was like. If they were grossly under eating, we'll perform longer. If they have been eating well, then we'll perform for a shorter period of time. And then we alter it based on what we see: performance, measurements, scale, sleep, those kind of things doing. Cunningham is an equally great equation. It just, like I said, you need to make sure you've got adequate data that is performed well in order to utilize that effectively. All right. Anything else I can answer for you guys today? No? Okay, well, like I said, if you have any questions, John does have my contact information. You can always reach me at Parkview Sports Medicine as well. I'm happy to have discussions with you about anything. And, in any way that I can help, I'm always here.